Welcome friends, foes, and all good folks in between. My name is Paynexon, and I'm here to bring you the next stage of my top Dark Souls 2, 3, and Bloodborne's boss list. This is my second video cataloging my top 60 bosses. So if you missed the previous video, don't worry about it. Keep watching. You don't have to watch that video because you're probably just like me and you're way too lazy to. In any case, the 15 bosses from the previous video will come up in a minute. Until then, I'd like to remind all the Souls trolls out there that this list is made up of my favorite and least favorite bosses, and if you don't like it, you can get out. I'd also like to briefly remind everyone that I haven't played Dark Souls 1 or Demon's Souls, so none of the bosses from those respective games will appear on this list. So without any further delays, here's the 15 bosses from the previous video that you may have missed before we roll right into my next 15 on this wild Souls adventure.
Like a moth drawn to a flame, your wings will burn in anguish, time after time. For that is your fate, the fate of the cursed.
This odd-looking boss will always hold a special place in my heart as being the first boss I ever defeated without taking any damage on my first try. For that, this great one will always hold a special place in my heart. But then I remember that as far as bosses goes, he's really nothing special. Sure, he's got some cool laser attacks, and he rips off his arms in the middle of the fight, which I gotta admit is pretty hilarious. But like the last giant before him, it ultimately makes no difference in this almost by-the-numbers boss battle. Still, I've got to admit that as far as large bosses go in Bloodborne, he's still one of my preferred. Ah, Nashandra, the penultimate boss of Dark Souls 2 and one of the Shards of Manus. As far as bosses go, Nashandra is easily the worst of the endgame bosses compared to Gwyn Gehrman and the Soul of Cinder. Still, as far as Dark Souls 2 bosses go, I'd still put her on the positive end of the spectrum where bosses go. Mostly, this boss gets her boost from the list based on her lore, as the Shards of Manus are ranked among some of my favorite lore in the Dark Souls series, although among the daughters, she's easily my least favorite. Still, her fight is pretty simple, and if it weren't for the curse orbs that covet her arena, she'd be even easier than her brother-in-law Aldia. So yes, this boss is disappointing, especially for how important her role is in the game. I mean, I can't possibly understand why Vendrick was so afraid of her. But I guess if she was a boss worth fearing, she'd be higher up on this list. You might remember how in the last video I said that there was no good dragon bosses in the base game of Dark Souls 2. Well, that still applies here. The ancient dragon has some mixed lore behind him that makes him interesting, but honestly, nothing could save this boar from being any higher on this list. In fact, the only thing earning this titan a spot in my top 60 in the first place was my reaction to beating him. It was a sigh of relief and admittedly a little bit of pleasure. The ancient dragon was basically, he has the most health in the game, and every boss in the Souls series bows down to that health. And while he has about 3 to 5 different attacks total, all of them are almost one-hit KO each, making this boss a must-do flawless in order to win. But ironically, that's still not too difficult. Bringing this guy down isn't worth more than his position at the low 43. This guy is the poster child of any boss in the Souls series that does huge damage from a vast amount of moves that are each incredibly difficult to dodge. I mean, seriously, every attack in this guy's arsenal is devastating. While none are typically one-shot kills, they each have the potential to cripple your health while being incredibly difficult to dodge. I seriously had a tough time with this guy, and I still do. He's not that fun to fight, and out of Dark Souls 3 bosses, he's possibly the most unfair. But I won't lie when I say, like almost all Dark Souls 3 bosses, he's a true thrill ride from start to finish. So in the end, Sheep doesn't trump amusing, as the Old Demon King makes this list just barely in my top 45. I want to start by giving an honest shout out to whoever posted the message next to the windmill outside the boss fight to light it on fire. Thanks to you, you basically allowed this boss in the top 60. And you allowed me to beat Mython my first try, so thank you. So needless to say though, I did enjoy this fight without the poison littering the battleground. It's a pretty simple, by the numbers 1v1 that I just enjoyed. It was simple in that she wasn't huge and she didn't have a whole bunch of allies helping her out. All she had was a few base attacks that you could either dodge or block. She wasn't too hard, and she wasn't too easy. And this was enough to earn her her spot, deserving of this simple fight. Unlike Lud or Zalin, I'll admit there is some enjoyment to this fight, and the run-up isn't anywhere near as unforgivable as the latter. Ava and most of the bosses on this list in the 15 are pretty simple and by the numbers, in that there's nothing too deadly or too standoutish about them. You can fight him when he is completely invisible, but I don't know why you would possibly want to do that. When he is visible, he's your typical high-end boss health and does moderate damage in turn, but out of all of his attacks, the only one that's truly difficult to dodge is his side slash. It comes pretty suddenly and without warning. But once you've learned all of his moveset, this guy won't trouble you ever again. The second boss of Dark Souls 3 is our friendly guard dog Vort of the Boreal Valley, and man, his entrance is pretty epic. At this point in the series, I'd only ever fought the Cleric Beast in Udix Gundr, and while I'd seen almost countless boss battles by this point, it was still a pleasant surprise to face this guy. After playing through Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, he kinda reminds me of the Bloodstarved Beast. I'm not sure why, but they seem similar, except Vort replaces poison with frost. And while he's incredibly easy as far as bosses go, Vort is still really cool in both design and combat mechanics. In his second stage, Vort begins to do a charge that hits like a freight train, but also makes the fight way more intense and interesting. Because of this move alone, this guy has been bumped up to the list of number 39. Remember how I said in this video 15 they were almost all by the number bosses? Well, that doesn't end here, and Veldstadt defines that statement perfectly. Seriously, this guy is your typical big but not massive enemy with slow and telegraphed attacks. He's not challenging and seems to have an almost similar setup to the old hero from Demon Souls, minus the whole I'm blind mechanic. I don't know, maybe it's just me. Still, I don't think anyone out there disagrees with me when I say Veldstadt isn't tough by any means, and because of this, I find it very, very hard to believe that this guy not only held his own against Rain, but beat him. In the end though, this fight is fun, admittedly, but nothing special, and beating him opens the doorway to one of the most memorable sights of Dark Souls 2. Isn't it just a sin that this was my first experience with the legendary Dragon Slayer Ornstein? It should have been ONS, but sadly that wasn't the case. When I first walked through the fog gate to meet this mythical character, I had 3 Estus flasks left from my run-up to dealing with every single enemy in the area, including the Guardian Dragon. When I saw him, I literally was like, oh, I'm fucked. I ended the fight only using 1 flask, which came from being hit literally at the beginning of the fight. That'll let you know how easy this boss is. Even so, this 1v1 is still pretty great, mostly because I love the background and his epic partnership with Smo. But in the end, that still isn't enough to save this guy from the lowly number 37. Ah, sweet memories. You know when I said the Cleric Beast was my first boss? Of course you don't. You probably have the attention span of a rat. But while Eudix may have been the second, I consider him the crazy uncle that truly brought me into the Souls series. He kicked my ass 2 or 3 times when I first started, but I met one hell of an epic offensive that put me on top of the world when I beat him. Seriously, it was awesome. If not for the introductory boss, I wouldn't even be here today doing these lists. But the only problem with Eudix is that when all that nostalgia of that first fight wears off, you find that this boss is already dead. Yeah, this fight is over in less than 30 seconds every time for any New Game Plus player, and that does diminish the value of this fight quite a bit, but that's okay. Gunder may be down and out, but his past life will come back to haunt you in this list later down the road. Okay, this fight gets its placement very much the same way as the old Iron King did. The build up to Vendrick is enormous. Like the entire Dark Souls 2 experience was talking about him and your journey to Drang Lake. Now, like many of these fights, I'd witnessed Vendrick being fought before I even got to him in my game. So I knew what I was in for. He's a one-man crushing crew in the form of a slow wrecking ball. If he hits you, and you're not built like a tank yourself, it's probably lights out. Still, if you played safe and you've collected all the 5 giant souls like a man, he shouldn't be a problem. Other than the lore though, I will give him bonus points for that music. You know, that plays right when you come into the area before the boss fight. I know it's cheating for adding it because it's not actually during the boss fight, but it needs to be mentioned. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this Quelaag ripoff. Obviously the love does outweigh the hate since she's hovering over a few good bosses, so I guess we'll start there. When I got to her, I struggled immensely because I was really underleveled, and the clunky movements of Dark Souls 2 made dealing with her pretty difficult, but I will say out of all the Dark Souls 2 bosses, I can happily say that at least she's fair. I know, that's not something you typically look for in a good boss, but it's huge for me. I like the bosses hard. Really hard, phrasing, but fair. And Najka, she has that. Now, she does do pretty high damage for a boss not too far into the game, and plenty of attacks are difficult to dodge if you haven't put in the proper points to stamina. She took me 4 or 5 tries because my stamina was not that great. And she caused me to shed some real salt during these fights. Still, after coming out victorious, I could honestly look back on this fight and say, I had a pretty damn good time. Entering this room was awesome. I knew immediately that she was a Shard of Manus as her model looks almost identical to Nashandra's. That quickly opened up a huge amount of possibilities for who was coaxing Sin to silence the Sunken City. I don't know what her part was, but you can bet your ass that she was pulling the strings behind the fall of the city. As far as bosses go too, I actually really enjoyed fighting her. Sure, she ganks you partway through the fight with some skeletons, but they actually fit the fight pretty well. And they are a hell of a lot better than, Nassandra's curse orbs, at least. I ended up killing Alana just as she was summoning Velstadt, so I can't really talk about, that from a judgment point of view. But I still enjoy the first boss of the Crown of the Sunken City DLC, and that's all I care about. Because in the end, that's all that matters. Alright, this guy is just cool. Sure, he only has 3 or 4 moves in his arsenal, but the fight is just fun, and I love running into this guy all over the world in random locations. As for the actual boss fight, guarding the secret entrance to the Lost Bastille and the Giant Memory, I have to admit, I totally didn't find this guy till the very end of the game when I was searching for the giant souls, so I was ridiculously overleveled when I got to him. Like, I must have been 150 or something. So, as you can see in this video, my rock club does ridiculous damage. I ended up putting away my shield at the very end when I realized I didn't even need to parry the big guy. I still did though, just for fun. And that's what this fight is. It's fun. Welcome to number 32, Pursuer. And the last boss on this list for today is the lovely lady, the Lost Sinner. This prisoner of pain is also up for a true split decision for me. Part of me despises her as the one who inducted me into Dark Souls 2's bullshit-ass hitboxes. So ultimately, she's hard and moderately unfair, especially come New Game Plus, when she's accompanied by a pair of pyromancers. But that's besides the point. Fuck you, Dark Souls 2 ganks. But this is about the Sinner, not her sidecars. The fight itself is incredibly straightforward. Like many of Dark Souls 2 bosses, she has like less than 5 moves. 2 different side swipes, a lunge, and an aerial attack. That's it. And yet, it took me over 10 tries to crush this great soul boss. It's not even the arena when it's steeped in darkness if you didn't get the Bastille key to light the flames outside the fog gate. It's all about how vicious she is. The Lost Sinner never lets up the whole match. If she hits you once, you better pick and choose your Estus chugging because the Lost Sinner is unforgivable. And in the end, that makes her my kind of boss, unfair or not. The Lost Sinner earns her spot, just barely outside the top 30. Well, that's the end of this 15, and in my opinion, that finally crosses off the last of the lame or bad bosses. From here on out, it's nothing but the best, and I can't wait to touch on the next 15, who are the beginning of the cream of the crop for From Software bosses. And I can't wait to bring it to you. But until then, if you enjoy this video, I hope you dislike and subscribe to me just so you can unsubscribe in the next second. I'm Payne Nixon, and I'll see you another time. Perhaps.